It's one of my favorite days of the year. The 2025 ZiPS projections for the San Francisco Giants are out. Who comes in with a rosy projection? Who comes in with a pessimistic one? And what does it say about the team overall as we get ready for the winter meetings?
You are Locked On Giants, your daily San Francisco Giants podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome to Locked On Giants, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, where it's your team every day. My name is Ben Kaspick, and on this show we provide episodes 3 days a week for now, talking about the San Francisco Giants in a way that's data-driven and rational, but also simple, passionate, and accessible to all. I'm a former contributor for the baseball statistics and analysis websites Beyond the Box Score and Rotographs. I've been podcasting about the Giants since 2015, coming up on 10 years that I've been doing this. Actually, it would be entering year 11. Been hosting this show for since the start of the 2019 season, I should say, and I'm a lifelong Giants fan. Thank you for making Locked On Giants your first listen every day. We're free and available wherever you get your podcasts, including YouTube, so check us out there if you have not already, and please hit that subscribe button wherever it is that you're following the show. You can start the season with a big return on FanDuel. New customers can place a $5 bet and you'll get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. And where we get started is, like I said, one of my favorite days of the year. I say it every year when it happens, is the release of the ZiPS projections for the San Francisco Giants. So we've been doing this every year ever since I started doing this show, and this year is no different, and we get to it as soon as they come out. So ZiPS is one of the major projection systems out there that's public, and one of the better ones as well, I should add. And for the I meant to say it's created by Dan Szymborski, and he's been hired to be a writer and analysis giver over at Fangraphs. And so when he does these, he doesn't just spit out a bunch of numbers and say, that's it, and that's all. He gives a little write-up. And so not only do we have the actual physical projections, but there's a little write-up about the state of the team. And so we'll get into the strengths and weaknesses, as well as some important projections, looking at guys like Tyler Fitzgerald, Heliot Ramos, Jung Hoo Lee, who, we didn't get it was breakout seasons for Ramos and Fitzgerald, and then Jung Hoo Lee, we didn't get to fully see at all what he could do. And so those projections are going to be important to look at. But just glancing, there's a little graphic. If you're on Twitter, you probably have seen the graphic where it shows wins above replacement by position. And the first thing that jumps off the page to me is that there are 4+ win players or positions, I guess I should say, on the Giants at catcher, third base, and Logan Webb. And so that's a good starting point, and we're going to see what Dan Szymborski ultimately says about where he thinks this team currently stands. And so jumping right in, the first place to start is where Dan Szymborski starts. He says, well, the Giants have solved at least one problem, finding another Buster Posey. And so I thought he was going to make a little comment about because Buster Posey is now the president of baseball operations, but he didn't do that at all. He said, not in the form of Joey Bart, as was the original intention for a few years, but rather in Patrick Bailey. Now, Bailey isn't quite peak Posey, an unreasonable expectation to have of anyone, but he has become a legitimate star behind the plate. Bailey also doesn't exhibit the same distribution of talent as Posey did, as Bailey is arguably the most valuable defensive player in baseball, with just enough bat to make that drool worthy. To make a reference, I don't know what this reference means. He said to make a reference that's even too old for me. So it's way too old for me. So we won't go there. And then he says Bailey isn't the only high spot in the lineup. Matt Chapman, who it seems the projections were not too high on in 2024 after all, meaning Chapman had a good projection for 2024, and it probably caused some people to raise eyebrows because he was coming off a down year and maybe some like apparent decline that wasn't just one blip of a down year. But like he's saying, I mean, in fact, Matt Chapman is projected to be even better than Patrick Bailey, and Dan Zaborski's drooling over Patrick Bailey. And so he says Matt Chapman should have at least a few good years left in him, and the Giants are generally at least average-ish elsewhere. So this has been a recurring theme since I've been doing this show outside of the first couple years once they turned some things over, because Farhan Zaidi did inherit a pretty bad team and expensive team, so they weren't really able to do much in the way of spending, and it took a while, and then they've just been mostly mediocre, and even in the 107-win seasons, the projections were mostly mediocre, and so there's just a lot of, we've heard this over and over, that there's no huge glaring black hole spot in the lineup, but what you do see is average-ish and a little too much of it. It's not the worst thing, as we'll see when he talks about where this team looks in terms of wins and losses. But he says, ZiPS is higher than the other systems on Tyler Fitzgerald, and both the computer and I are hoping to see what Jung Hoo Lee can do after injuries cost him the opportunity to make good on what was shaping up to be a middling at best debut in the U.S. And so I'm going to pause right there and interject that to say it was shaping up to be a middling at best debut, maybe I'm seeing this through orange tinted glasses, but he played 37 games. You know, it's not like he had 100 games played or even 80 or something. 37 games. Yeah, it was middling at best, but also he pretty significantly underperformed his expected numbers on offense. And I recall he was hitting line drives all over the place that were getting caught. And so I am excited to see. He says both the computer and I and Ben and a lot of you are excited or hoping to see what Jung Hoo Lee can do. But what is that better? He says ZiPS is higher than the other systems on Tyler Fitzgerald. And so where does the system see Tyler Fitzgerald? Well, the projection for Fitzgerald, and this is the median projection, is just a 239 average and 300 on base, but a 418 slugging, which comes out to about league average offense. And so the system being higher than most on him is largely coming from just holding his own offensively, but also contributing with his legs and defensively. And the projection is 2.5 wins above replacement per ZiPS in just 491 plate appearances. They are putting him at shortstop largely because currently that spot does project to be Fitzgerald, but that doesn't mean that's what it will be. Does that make sense? Because currently he projects as their best shortstop, I think, right now, but that doesn't mean that's what what they'll go into the year with. And so those are kind of the key standouts on offense. And for Jung Hoo Lee, by the way, the projection is that of, let's see, a 281 batting average. So once again, that's very high. I mean, league average in 2024 and for several years has been in the 240s. And so 280 something is always going to be top 10% of the league, but a 281 average, 337 on base, 400 slugging, 109. I think I said weighted runs created plus for Fitzgerald, but he's using OPS plus, and a 109 OPS plus for Jung Hoo Lee. and just 2 wins above replacement in 448 plate appearances. Heliot Ramos, how about him? A solid projection, 10% above average offense, 256 average, 316 on base, 432 slugging, and 2.3 wins above replacement. And so, yeah, and then you look at Yastrzemski, about 2 wins above replacement, which is just, it's kind of a running joke at this point. He just consistently does that and just is about a league average regular in the league. And so that's what the projection system continues to see in Mike Yastrzemski, which makes sense why they tendered him a contract, because a league average player makes more than $9.25 million a year in free agency. So you'd have to pay more if you were to go out and try to sign a league average player than you do to just keep the one you already have for less. And when it comes to prospects, not so great. Marco Luciano projected to be about 15% below average offensively, and Luis Matos 10% below average offensively. I was eager to see Bryce Eldridge, and sure enough, comes in at what would be his age 19 season at almost average offensively. And that's exciting. A 243 average. And again, that's about league average. 303 on base, 401 slugging. That's a 98 OPS plus out of a guy who I believe will be, he will be 19 for all of 2020, the 2025 season. Excuse me, I'm wrong. He's 20. So he'll be 20 for all of the 2025 season. And so that's an exciting projection for Eldridge. So coming up in just a minute, we will turn our attention to pitchers and just generally look at what does Szymborski think of the team overall. So all of that coming up in just a second. And before we get into it, today's episode of Locked On Giants is brought to you in part by our good friends over at FanDuel. Get ready to tackle the NFL action with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook, because right now new customers can bet $5 and get $150 in bonus bets if you win. The FanDuel Sportsbook app gives you everything you need to place live bets on the NFL all in one place. So when you get a hunch in the middle of the game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today. You'll get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. So, of course, I would just look for the most lopsided action and place that $5 bet and hope to win and get that $150 in bonus bets. That's at FanDuel.com. Never waste a hunch and make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the NFL. All right, here we go. We are going to continue running through these ZiPS projections. Always a fun time of the year. He does them in random order, and I feel like the Giants have been one of the last teams to go in many of the years I've been doing this podcast. So good to see them firmly in the top half of teams to go this season. Thanks again for making Locked On Giants your first listen today. And so coming up tomorrow, everydayers will be getting into, the Giants have announced their coaching staff. So they made a couple of hires to their hitting group, and that's going to be really interesting to get into. We also have a new pro scouting director to talk about, the golden at bat thing, which we haven't gotten into yet. We're saving all that. And then the winter meetings are next week. And I expect, because industry insiders expect, Juan Soto may very well have chosen his team before the winter meetings start. And then that could really kick things off with all these other free agents. It does seem the Giants are not involved with Juan Soto, which is disappointing, but ultimately I think most people believe he wouldn't have ended up here anyway, even if they were involved. So maybe best to put their attention elsewhere. We shall see. Sometimes you just never know. The mystery team and all that jazz. So moving on to the ZiPS, not moving on, but continuing on with the ZiPS projections. those are the most significant ones to look at. I mean, Wade Meckler comes in with a solid projection. He's on the 40-man roster, someone to think about. And it likes David VR. He said in the write-up something about how he may end up on the Dodgers one day and put up a couple of random 5-WAR seasons. So ZiPS likes David VR, but we'll see if he ever really gets an opportunity in San Francisco. And heaven forbid he actually does end up on the Dodgers and putting up some big seasons. But I think it's time to move on to the pitchers, where Dan Szymborski, I think, correctly states that starting pitching is a need, essentially. And he says, if ZiPS is to be believed, and if you're reading a ZiPS article, you're reading a ZiPS article, so hopefully you're at least open to believing it, the pitching, more specifically the starting pitching, is San Francisco's biggest obstacle. Well, I'll just, again, interject and say, well, thankfully, especially with Buster Posey at the helm, maybe there's less of a hesitance to give long-term deals to pitchers. This should be the area where they have the easiest time bringing in talent. And so he says biggest obstacle, but I would say biggest weakness at present. But it also depends. Like, ZiPS is not a fan of any of these young pitchers, but I think watching them with my eyes, Landon Roop, Hayden Birdsong, and others, there's a lot of upside here that the computer, I did it in air quotes, I don't know why it is, a computer doesn't see. But I think I'm a little higher on some of these young guys than ZiPS after watching them. And he says, for the umpteenth year in a row, ZiPS is super into Logan Webb, who has steadily ranked in the top 3 for WAR over X number of future years for about 3 years now, only occasionally swapping places with hurlers like Corbin Burns. The problem, of course, isn't Webb. And so that's interesting to break that down. He's saying, projecting forward, there's like only a couple of guys in the game projected to have to be better over the life of their careers moving forward than Logan Webb. And he's kind of swapping with guys like Corbin Burns, who is one of the, projected to land a contract possibly north of $200 million this offseason. And that's good. And you could literally be the team that gets Corbin Burns and pairs him with Logan Webb, which would just be an awesome 1-2 punch in that rotation. But beyond Logan Webb, Szymborski says the problem is that ZiPS just does not want anything to do with the rest of the rotation. Robbie Ray's projection is fine enough, but meaning Dan Szymborski, is not sure how comfortable he would be banking on it. ZiPS is still unsure about Kyle Harrison, and while there were some things to like about Jordan Hicks as a full-time starter, ZiPS doesn't care for the disappearance of his strikeout rate. It does expect a better season given this, that, and the other, talking about Keaton Wynn. And then he says, the bullpen's outlook is much sunnier. ZiPS is downright excited about both Ryan Walker and the prospect of seeing Eric Miller continue as a full-time reliever. His ERA projection purely as a reliever would be 2.66. ZiPS still has 2022 starts in his profile. ZiPS likes Tristan Beck more than Steamer, which is another major projection system. And while it sees some ballooning of the ERAs of the Rodgerses, they're still contributors. The computer's even giving Camilo Doval a good bounce-back projection, which doesn't surprise me, Ben. All told, it's enough to push the Giants into above-average territory among bullpens. And then I'll just deliver this line here. All in all, the Giants look like a team that's hovering around 500, or possibly a skosh, is that how you say it? Above, not below. For Giants fans, that's not an unfamiliar place to be after the last 3 seasons. Now, keep in mind, this is after losing Blake Snell, so that speaks to the underperformance in 2024 versus the talent they had. They should have been better. Like, going into the year, we expected better than 80 and 82. And so starting at a point of 500 or a little better is much better than I think people think, because if you add a Corbin Burns and or a Willy Adames and or a Ha-Seong Kim and just shore up some spots, but maybe add some impact in that rotation and just roll with, like Posey has telegraphed very, very explicitly, pitching and defense. Well, what better way than to go out and get some impact pitching like Corbin Burns? I'm all in on the idea of getting a Corbin Burns. Max Fried is out there. There are some good pitchers out there, and the Giants bullpen, I agree. I mean, Ryan Walker, what he did stepping in for Doval, I'm downright excited about Ryan Walker. The projection is a 3.03 ERA over 71 and a third innings. Logan Webb projection 3.22 ERA in almost 200 innings. Robbie Ray 3.90 ERA in 108 and a third innings is the projection. It's not too rosy after that, looking at the starters, which, I understand. Although Landon Roop, the projection is a 3.92 ERA, and that doesn't really get mentioned here. Doval 3.46, Eric Miller 3.77. Yeah, he's not going to start. I don't know. He was a full-time reliever, so the projection should be more like 2.66, because that's what he said it would be if he was a full-time reliever. So anyway, I just think that overall, this system, seeing the team as 500 or a little bit better right now, is encouraging. And then you've got some foundational pieces in Bailey and Chapman and Webb, all of whom are under team control for at least 4 more seasons, and more in the case of Bailey and Chapman. And then you could make some long-term commitments to some guys this winter, whether it's Burns or Max Fried or Adames or Ha-Seong Kim. And so, speaking of one of those guys, we will turn our attention to a rumor, or report, I should say, actually, about one of those position players involving the Giants. So we will get into that in just a minute, and before we do, all right, here we go. We are going to get into the latest on the Giants' potential interest in a couple of players. The first one I wanted to get into is Willy Adames, because we had Mark Feinsand of MLB.com reporting, it was, I think, yesterday, that he wrote an article about Adames, or a little blurb or whatever it was, and said another club with serious interest in Adames is the Giants, who continue to seek offensive help. San Francisco is also looking at Ha-Seong Kim, who has connections with both manager Bob Melvin and outfielder Jung Hoo Lee. At last month's GM meetings, president of baseball operations Buster Posey confirmed that shortstop was an area he was looking to upgrade this offseason. Quote, "If we could find a shortstop, that would be great," Posey said. Quote, "I think Tyler Fitzgerald did a great job at short last year. I think he has value in multiple spots on the field. I do think it's hard to play multiple spots at the same time during the season. Whether he'd be better suited to play second base long term is a discussion we're having." So I've said this before, I'll say it again. I'm not saying it's a certainty, but I would place a wager on the Giants ending up with one of Willy Adames or Ha-Seong Kim. I think if they were to sign either Corbin Burns or Max Fried, two really good pitchers with qualifying offers attached to them, then I wouldn't see Willy Adames. I think Ha-Seong Kim would make more sense. So it's kind of maybe like an either or. You get one qualifying offer guy from one tier and then the other from the other tier. Like, if you get Corbin Burns, then it means Ha-Seong Kim. And if you get Willy Adames, it means no Corbin Burns or Max Fried. So maybe that, to me, makes a Corbin Burns or Max Fried more likely than Willy Adames. But it is. I'm sure the Giants are just doing their due diligence on all these guys who are realistic targets for them. Because even if they cut payroll, they could afford we discussed this yesterday. They're at about 155 million in projected payroll, and so their opening day payroll in 2024 was like 208 million. Not the luxury tax payroll. That's not what we're talking about. We're trying to do apples to apples here. We could talk about 2024 luxury tax payroll versus 2025 luxury tax payroll, but we're just doing non-luxury tax payroll apples to apples instead of switching them up. Anyway, hope that makes sense. But so at 155, you could add a $30 million a year contract, like say Corbin Burns, and that would put you at 185. So the problem is, I mean, maybe it's not a problem, but at that point, I've seen contract projections for like Ha-Seong Kim kind of range from 12 million all the way up to 20. And so if it was 12 and you were at 185, you could get up to 197 with adding Ha-Seong Kim, and you would be about 10 million under last year. But those would be your only two moves. But then you still have the ability to trade people. And so all I'm saying is, even at some of their Corbin Burns universally projected around 30 million a year. Kim, like I said, up to 20. So let's just call it 20 and say that's adding 50 million to 155. Well, you're right around where you were last year. So that wouldn't really be cutting payroll. So we shall see how it plays out. There's also the trade market. I don't know what Bo Bichette figures to be making this year, but I think he makes some sense, although the Blue Jays are saying they won't trade him. This, that, and the other. I'll have to see I'll have to at some point do a deep dive, if they don't just land a shortstop soon, see which players are possible options at that position, because it does seem pretty obvious that they will end up acquiring a shortstop from outside the organization this offseason. And I do just think starting pitcher is another area where they could really do something, and they probably have a bit of an advantage when it comes to Corbin Burns if they want him, because he is from California, Bakersfield. I don't know if he grew up a Giants fan and went to college at St. Mary's here in Northern California. I don't know if that is the Bay Area, right? I don't know exactly if that's Bay Area. It's what, Northeast Bay? Not Northeast, but just East Bay out there a little bit. So anyway, I just think that's kind of the roadmap, and it's been expressed by Posey, pitching and defense. Well, Ha-Seong Kim is an elite defender. He's dealing with an injury that he sustained on a pickoff attempt, diving back into a base. There's a little less defensive certainty with Willy Adames, who had like an uncharacteristic, really poor down year by all kinds of different metrics this year. So that scares me a little bit, but I don't know. I would be thrilled with Corbin Burns and Ha-Seong Kim. I still think some work around the edges would be needed, but at the same time, you could do that. And like I said, if Ha-Seong Kim really does cost $12 million a year, I don't know, give him 6 years at $12 million a year, and it comes out to a hefty amount for this player, something in that range, then you go from there and give Corbin Burns 7 years at $30 million a year, and bada bing, bada boom. I really would like those moves. So the other thing to note, just regarding Corbin Burns, because this name is getting said a lot by me today and yesterday, Jon Heyman, who's notoriously not the most trustworthy. I think he's someone who does speak for agent Scott Boras very often, frankly, in the media, through the media. But he says on Corbin Burns, he says, quote, Yanks, Jays, Red Sox, Giants, Orioles are among main players for Corbin Burns. NYY, meaning Yankees, could potentially do both Soto and Burns. And then he does parentheses and says, but of course, they'd look to save money elsewhere if they did. So that kind of reeks of Scott Boras saying the Yankees could do both. Well, I don't know if I see that, but we'll see. And then it's worth realizing that all these teams outside of the Giants and Orioles, Yankees, Jays, and Red Sox, are all believed to be among the front runners for Juan Soto. And so there really does seem to be a correlation, and it's logical, and we discussed this yesterday, between Soto signing and then the losers on Soto, the teams that tried to get him but didn't end up getting him, perhaps deciding to allocate a large amount of that money to Corbin Burnes instead. And just by the way, I got a question on Instagram. I don't get a lot of questions over there, but somebody asked about not understanding at all why a team like the Giants would even consider paying $600 million for Juan Soto when you could spend like $200 million on Corbin Burnes and then like $400 million on other, go out and get also Max Fried or whoever else and have it add up to $600 million. And it just seems like a much better use of money. Well, it's just really important to understand it's not about the total value of the contract. It's about the annual cost of the contract. And so Juan Soto is likely to get, whether there's deferrals or not, that matters a lot, but somewhere in the $45 million range in terms of what he costs per year. And Corbin Burnes is going to cost somewhere in the range of $30 million per year. And so that makes it much closer than if you're thinking $600 million versus $200 million. It's not $400 million. That's not the right way to think about it, because for Soto, it's that the reason it gets to such a huge number is because of the years. But it's about teams base their payrolls on what are they paying guys per year, and that's where they cap it off. At a certain number per year, they won't spend anymore. And so that's what needs to be thought about. And so if you were to get Burnes and Fried and Willy Adames, I think that was also mentioned, you're exceeding the cost of Juan Soto per year by getting those three players, no doubt. And that's the relevant and important way to think about it. So anyway, that is all the time we have for today. Thanks again for making Locked On Giants your first listen today. For your second listen, find Locked On MLB. Baseball guru Sully brings a daily blend of humor and baseball, keeping you updated on every rumor and story throughout the offseason. Find Locked On MLB on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. Once again, my name is Ben Kaspick. Check me out on Twitter or X at Ben Kaspick, Kaspick. If you like this show, please consider rating it or leaving a review. It helps me out so much. So thank you in advance, and thanks to everyone who's done so already. I can't wait to be with you again tomorrow. Thanks again for listening today. You are now Locked On Giants.